Hi, my name's Sandie Cleland and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology at Aberdeen. Now, one of my research interests, and certainly the thing that I teach most on our degree programs, is the psychology of language. Now, what that means is I'm interested in, what are the factors that influence the way that we use language? How do we understand language when somebody speaks to us? And one of the things I'm interested in particularly is ambiguity in language. So when we're communicating with someone and the words that we use have got more than one meaning, how does that affect how that language is understood? And what does that mean for when we process language? So what I'm going to talk about today is, this ambiguity in communication. What do I mean by this? And what can psychology tell us? What can psychological research tell us about ambiguity in communication? I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's really important. And I'll finish up by saying, what can we do to avoid ambiguity when we're communicating with other people? So just to get started, what do I mean by linguistic ambiguity? Well, this can be a property of language itself. So words can have more than one meaning, for example. Now, we call this lexical ambiguity. So if I have a sentence like, the fisherman went to the bank. Now, bank can have more than one meaning. It might mean the bank of a river, but it could also mean a financial institution. So there's an ambiguity there in terms of which meaning of that word does the speaker intend when they communicate? Or I saw lots of bats. Do I mean bats, the flying animal, or do I mean a cricket bat? You see a lot of these in headlines. So Disney plans to start shooting Bambi. Well, shooting could mean more than one thing, right? You can also have structural ambiguity. Now, structural ambiguity relates to the underlying structure of a sentence, and how we understand the underlying structure of a sentence can alter its meaning. So if I have a sentence like, enraged cow injures farmer with axe, now it could be that the farmer had an axe and that a cow attacked the farmer. Or it could mean that it's less likely, admittedly, but it could be the cow who had the axe and that the cow used this to injure the farmer. And the different interpretations that we have of this sentence will depend on how we interpret its underlying structure. I have another newspaper headline here. I collect bad newspaper headlines. But bus smashes into restaurant claiming to be the only one to survive the Great Fire of London. Now, we assume that it's the restaurant that claims to be the only one to survive the Great Fire of London, but it sounds a bit like they mean it was the bus. And again, the ambiguity here arises because the underlying structure of that sentence can be interpreted in two different ways. Now, very often linguistic ambiguity is very much about what the speaker intended. So sometimes the ambiguity is entirely about what did the speaker really mean when they produced this utterance. Now, these can be small things, but they can be really important. So the example that I have here is from a court case. This was the Derek Bentley court case. Now, Derek Bentley received the death penalty for his involvement in the shooting of a police officer. Now, Bentley didn't actually pull the trigger, but he was at the scene of the crime. And at his court case, a lot of the debate revolved around a phrase that he used just before the police officer was shot. Now, he said to the person that pulled the trigger, "Let him have it." Now, the debate around this phrase, "let him have it," boils down to ambiguity about what the speaker's intent was. Did he mean let him have it in the sense of give him the gun? In which case he wasn't to blame for the shooting because that wasn't his intention for the police officer to be shot. Or did he mean shoot him? Now, what this is about is, do we interpret let him have it as having a literal interpretation to hand the gun, or as having this figurative interpretation to shoot someone? So, this is quite an extreme example, but ambiguity, it can be really, kind of a life or death thing in this situation. Now, how common is ambiguity? Now, I'm going to argue that it's a lot more common than you might think. And we know this from what psychological research tells us. Okay, So there was an analysis of the Wall Street Journal. Now, the Wall Street Journal, obviously, it's a source that we would expect to pride itself on the clarity of communication. But psychologists have looked at the content of the language used in the Wall Street Journal. And in particular, they've looked at a certain type of structurally ambiguous sentence. Now, this is a type of sentence that can be difficult to understand. It's called a reduced relative. But the type of sentence it's something along the lines of, the ship sailed round the bay sank. Now, that sentence can be a little bit difficult to understand, because when you first read it, it's a bit ambiguous what the structure of the sentence is. But you can solve that just by using the word that. So if instead of saying the ship sailed round the bay sank, you can say the ship that sailed round the bay sank. Now, that sentence is a lot easier to understand. So if you want to communicate clearly, you can use this word that to make your sentences clearer in their intention. However, when you look at the Wall Street Journal, about a third of the time, so 33% of these kinds of sentences don't use the word that. So even though including it would make the language clearer, it turns out that we don't really do this. So very often, even though we could avoid ambiguity, we don't. And it turns out that there's evidence that speakers do this as well. So this was work done by Ferreira and Dell. What they did was to ask people to take part in a psychology experiment, and they had to produce these kinds of sentences, these sort of the ship sailed round the bay type sentences. Now, if speakers wanted to be really clear about what they were saying, they would include the word that in those sentences. But it turns out that about a quarter of the time, people don't bother. They could make their sentences clearer, but they actually don't. They just don't include a word that would make things clearer. So yeah, we can avoid ambiguity, but it seems like maybe we don't do it. And there's some quite interesting evidence that suggests that even our mood might affect how likely we are to avoid ambiguous language. So this was work done by Vera Kempe. Now, what she did was to get people to take part in a psychology experiment. But before they did the experiment, she induced a positive or a negative mood in these people. So she did this by showing them film clips and playing them happy music. So if you were in the happy condition, you would see a clip of, I think it was Bambi skating on ice, and you would hear some cheerful music. If you were in the negative condition, you would see a sad clip from a movie, and you would hear Barber's Adagio for strings, this very intense, sad piece of music. And then what she did was she asked people to produce language. Now, what she found was that when people were in a good mood, so when they'd seen a happy film clip and they'd listened to happy music, they were statistically more likely to use ambiguous language than the people who were in a sad mood. Now, this is a bit of a surprising finding, but I find it really interesting, because what it's telling us is that being in a good mood, so being happy, might actually be a barrier to communicating effectively, which is, yeah, interesting to say the least. So yeah, we do use ambiguous language, and possibly more so when we're happy. Now, are we aware that we're doing this? Now, again, I'm going to argue that based on what psychological research tells us, we actually aren't that aware of how ambiguous our language is, and we overestimate how well we communicate with other people. So this was work done by Keyser and Henley. What they did was they got people to produce sentences that could be ambiguous, okay? And there were different types of ambiguity they looked at. So it might be the structure. So if you have something like Boris shot the man with the gun, it's not entirely clear if the man has the gun or if Boris has the gun. And they would have sentences like currency is no longer exchanged by the banks. And again, banks here, it could be that this means banks in the sense of financial institution, but it could also mean some other type of bank, such as a river bank. Now, what Keyser and Henley found was that when people produce these kinds of sentences, 46% of the time, so we're talking about nearly half of the time, that people thought the listener had understood them correctly, they actually hadn't. That's quite a scary statistic to me. So what they're finding is when we produce ambiguous language, about half of the time that we think the person has understood what we've said, they haven't. Okay, so that's a worry, right? Why do we care? Okay, so these are psychological experiments, but why do we care about linguistic ambiguity? It's really, really important. I'm going to talk you through some examples from aviation, but I'm sure you can think of lots of settings where clear communication is just really important. Aviation is an interesting one because in aviation, very often you have people who are not in the same room as one another. So you have a pilot talking to air traffic control, for example. And when you have that situation, that makes communication more difficult because you can't use facial expression or body language to help you communicate. But the other thing about aviation is that we very often have a recording of the language that was used just before the incident, okay? And that's because of black box recording. So aviation gives us lots of examples where we know what went wrong, and we also know what the language was that was used immediately before things went wrong. So in this first example, I've got it. So in these examples come from a book called Fatal Words and a paper by someone called Kent Jones. And if you're interested in this stuff, it's worth having a look at these. In the case of I've Got It, what happened was there were two pilots. They were looking for the landing field where they were meant to land their airplane. Now, what happened was the co-pilot caught sight of the landing field and said to the pilot, "Oh, I've got it," meaning I can see the landing field. I know where we're meant to be landing. However, when the pilot heard the phrase "I've got it," they let go of the controls. Now, the reason that the pilot did this was that they interpreted the phrase "I've got it" to mean that the co-pilot had taken control of the plane. Clearly, this is not an ideal situation. In the second example, Go Ahead. In this case, what we have is a driver of a construction vehicle who wanted permission to drive onto the runway area. And they were in communication with the control tower asking whether they could do this. Now, what happened was the controller said to them, "Go ahead." What the controller meant was, "Now, I'm listening, please tell me what it is you want to ask me." What the driver of the construction vehicle heard was "go ahead," as in drive ahead. And so they headed off down the runway. Again, not an ideal situation. The last example here, and this is a very sad example, what does pull up mean? Now, these were actually the last words of a pilot. Now, what happened in this situation was they were coming into land, and the plane became dangerously close to the ground. Now, when this happens, there's a thing called the ground proximity alarm, and that worked perfectly. It alerted the pilot to the fact that the plane was too close to the ground. However, the way that it did this was to use English computer-generated speech, and it used the phrase "pull up." Now, the Chinese pilot did not know what the phrase "pull up" meant. It wasn't sufficiently literal. It wasn't clear enough that what pull up meant was to obviously, increase the altitude of the plane, and it had tragic consequences, and there were fatalities involved in this incident. So, you can see here from these examples, what has happened in each of these examples is that the meaning of what the speaker intended has not been understood by the listener, and that has resulted in some cases, tragic consequences. So, this ambiguity in communication is really important. To take another example, and this is a less serious example, but it's one that's quite pertinent to a lot of us, email communication. Okay, so right now, a lot of us are working from home. The communication that we would normally do in the corridor or standing in our co-worker's office to ask them a question, that's not really happening. There's a lot more emails. Well, I can't speak for anyone else, but I know I have a lot more emails than I used to. But email communication can be really difficult to interpret. Now, the thing with written communication, right, you don't have the tone of voice. You can't use the rhythm of your language. You don't have facial expression. All these things that we would normally use to help us interpret somebody's intent, they can't help us in email because they're not there. And I think we've all had that experience of being on the receiving end of an email and thinking, okay, I'm not sure what that meant. Is that person angry with me? Or are they being funny, or are they making a sarcastic comment? Sometimes it's really hard to read tone in email. It's notoriously difficult. And we've all seen these reply all marathons where suddenly everyone's very angry at each other, and maybe they didn't have to be. Now with email, cross-cultural differences can also create ambiguity because there are differences in how different people use language. So, for example, British English speakers can be quite indirect in their meaning. So to a British English speaker, if I say something's not bad, so I write to someone, oh, that report's not bad, that might mean I think it's quite good. But not bad will sound quite different to a US English speaker or to a non-native speaker of English. So there are all these kind of little cultural ticks in how we use language that can contribute to this as well. So what do we do? What do we do about all this? How can we avoid ambiguity? Well, it depends on the context that you're in. Okay, so in the case of kind of safety critical settings, so when we're talking about aviation, medicine, working on the factory floor, it's really important that we have standardized terminologies and protocols, language that avoids ambiguity, okay? So there need to be set phrases that we use that everybody understands, and they need to be very literal. There can't be any room for confusion in how these are used. It's really important that we stay away from things that are more colloquial. So something like pull up, for example, that is a bit colloquial, or figurative language, language that isn't entirely literal. We should be avoiding those in those kind of situations. And that's why it's really important to have guidelines about how language is used in these settings. It's also really important that people should feel able to ask for more information. And this becomes really important when you have work where there's quite a hierarchical structure. So an example might be in the medical setting, if you have a consultant talking to a junior doctor and the junior doctor doesn't quite understand the consultant's meaning, the junior doctor needs to feel that they are in an environment where they can ask for more information. Okay, so you have to have an environment where people feel able to question things if they don't understand them. And people kind of higher up in the hierarchy, they can't just assume that they've been understood. They need to, you make allowances for the fact that maybe people don't always understand what they say, and maybe they need to repeat things more than once to make sure that everything's clear. Turning to email, and this might be this is a bit more controversial, I think, but Amy Irwin, who also works in the psychology department here, Amy and I recently wrote an article for a newspaper, and we kind of floated the idea that in email, maybe we should start thinking about emojis as something that could help us with this. Now, there are some things you can do with email. If you're sending an email and you're not sure whether your intent has come across, one thing you can do is to read it out loud to yourself to get some sense of how your language comes across. But we argued that maybe another thing we could think about, are emojis, because emojis, they give us this ability to communicate nonverbal information. They replace these nonverbal cues. And, in an email where you're not sure whether the tone has come across properly, something as simple as a smiley face can actually go a long way in making someone feel a bit better about the message that you're communicating to them. As I said, I think this is a bit more controversial, and we associate emojis with more kind of, teenagers sending messages on Snapchat. But maybe there's a role for emojis in email communication and helping us be clear about what our intentions are. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about ambiguity. I'm going to leave you with one of my favourite ambiguous headlines: Peterborough Cathedral pancake, race, clergy, nurse flipping injuries. This is a real headline. If you understand what it means, then you're doing pretty well, I think. Thank you.